Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Agnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kada Mahyam Dadati Swaparantikam. Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yutapadakamalaam Sri Gurun Vaishnavanshcha Sri Rupam Sagrijatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Sri Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Visakanvitamscha हे कृष्ण करुणा सिंधो दीनबंधो जगत्पते गोपेश गोपिका कांता राधा कांता नमोस्तुते तप्त कांचन गौरंगी राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वंशाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्यः च पतितानं पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः नमः विष्णुपदाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्तस्वामी नितिनामिने नमस्ते सरस्वते देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाशतरिशतारिणे जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैतात् गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे. Okay, Haribo. So today we continue the chapter Prayers by the Personified Vedas to Krishna. Haribo. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, anyone who reaches the highest planets, the abode of Krishna, or even the Vaikuntha planets, never has to come down again to this miserable material condition of life. The Vedic recommendation, therefore, is that one makes the lotus feet of Vishnu the target of all one's efforts. Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. Vishnu Lokar, the Vishnu planets, are situated above all the material planets. These Vaikuntha planets are known as Sanatana Dhamma, and they are eternal. They are never annihilated, not even by the annihilation of this material world. The conclusion is that if a human being does not fulfill the mission of his life by worshipping the Supreme Lord and does not go back to Godhead, then it is to be understood that he has been frustrated in fulfilling the main purpose of human life. The next prayer of the personified Veda to the Lord concerns his entering into different species of life. It is stated in Bhagavad Gita 14th chapter that in every species and form of life, the spiritual part and parcel of the Supreme Lord is present. The Lord himself claims in the Gita that he is the seed-giving father of all forms and species, and therefore there must all be considered sons of the Lord. The entrance of the Supreme Lord into everyone's heart as Paramatma sometimes bewilders the impersonalists who think in terms of the equality of the living entities with the Supreme Lord. They think that because the Lord enters into different bodies along with the individual soul, there is no distinction between the Lord and the individual entities. Their challenge is, why should individual souls worship the Paramatma or Super Soul? According to them, both the Super Soul and the individual soul are on the same level. They are one, without any difference between them. There is a difference, however, between the super soul and in the individual soul, and this is explained in Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, wherein the Lord says that although he is situated with the living entity in the same body, he is superior. He is dictating to or giving intelligence to the individual soul from within. It is clearly stated in the Bhagavad Gita that the Lord gives intelligence to the individual soul and that both memory and forgetfulness are due to the influence of the super soul. No one can act independently of the sanctions of the super soul. Therefore, the individual soul acts according to his past karma, reminded by the Lord. The nature of the individual soul is forgetfulness, but the presence of the Lord within the heart reminds him of what he wanted to do in his past life. The intelligence of the individual soul is exhibited like a fire in wood. Although fire is always fire, it is exhibited in size proportionate to the size of the wood. Similarly, although the individual soul is qualitatively one with the Supreme Lord, he exhibits himself according to the limitations of his present body. The Supreme Lord or the Super Soul is said to be Eka Rasa. Eka means one. Oh, this is funny because in Finnish language, this Eka means first also. So it means kind of one. And Rasa means mellow. The transcendental position of the Supreme Lord is that of eternity, bliss, and full knowledge. His position of Eka Rasa does not change in the slightest when he becomes a witness and advisor to the individual soul in each individual body. The individual soul, beginning from Lord Brahma down to the ant, exhibits his spiritual potency according to his present body. The demigods are in the same category with the individual souls in the bodies of the human beings or in the bodies of lower animals. Intelligent persons, therefore, do not worship different demigods, who are simply infinitesimal representatives of Krishna manifesting in conditioned bodies. The individual soul can exhibit his power and potencies only in proportion to the shape and constitution of the body. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, can exhibit his full potencies in any shape or form without any change. The Mayavadi philosophers' thesis that God and the individual soul are one and the same cannot be accepted because the individual soul has to develop his power and potencies according to the development of different types of bodies. The individual soul in the body of a baby cannot show the full power and potency of a grown man. But the Supreme Person of Godhead Krishna, even when lying on the lap of his mother as a baby, could exhibit his full potency and power by killing Putana and other demons who tried to attack him. Therefore, the spiritual potency of the Supreme Person of Godhead is said to be Ekarasa, or without change. Therefore, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the only worshipable object, and this is perfectly known to persons who are uncontaminated by the force of material nature. In other words, only the liberated souls can worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Less intelligent Mayavadis take to the worship of demigods, thinking that the demigods and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are on the same level. The personified Vedas continued to offer their obeisances. Dear Lord, they prayed. After many births, those who have actually become wise take to the worship of your lotus feet in complete knowledge. This is also confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says that after many births, a great soul or Mahatma surrenders unto the Lord, knowing well that Vasudeva, Krishna, is the cause of all causes. The Vedas continued, as has already been explained, since our mind, intelligence, and senses have been given to us by God, when these instruments are actually purified, there is no alternative than to engage them in the devotional service of the Lord. A living entity's entrapment in different species of life is due to the misapplication of his mind, intelligence, and senses in material activities. Various kinds of bodies are awarded as the result of living entities' actions, and they are created by the material nature according to the living entity's desire. Because a living entity desires and deserves a particular kind of body, it is given to him by the material nature under the order of the Supreme Lord. In the Srimad Bhagavatam 3rd canto, it is explained that under the control of superior authority, a living entity is put within the semina of a male and injected into the womb of a particular female in order to develop a particular type of body. A living entity utilizes his senses, intelligence, mind in a specific way of his own choosing, and thus develops a particular type of body within which he becomes engaged. In this way, the living entity becomes situated in different species of life, either in demigod, human, or animal body, according to different situations and circumstances. It is explained in the Vedic literatures that the living entities entrapped in different species of life are part and parcel of Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers mistake the living entity for the Paramatma, who is actually sitting with the living entity as a friend. Because the Paramatma, the localized aspect of the Supreme Person of Godhead, and the individual living entity are both within the body, a misunderstanding sometimes takes place that there is no difference between the two. But there is definite difference between the individual soul and the supreme soul, and it is explained in the Varaha Purana as follows. The Supreme Lord has two kinds of parts and parcels. The living entity is called Vibhinnamsha, and the Paramatma, or the plenary expansion of the Supreme Lord, is called Svamsha. The Svamsha plenary expansion of the Supreme Person of Godhead is as powerful as the Supreme Person of Godhead himself. There is not even the slightest difference between the potency of the Supreme Person and that of his plenary expansion as Paramatma, but the Vibhinnamsha parts and parcels possess only a minute portion of the potencies of the Lord. The Narayana Pancharatra states that the living entity, who are the marginal potency of the Supreme Lord, are undoubtedly of the same duality of spiritual existence as the Lord himself, but they are prone to be tinged with material dualities. Because he is prone to be subjected to the influence of material dualities, the minute living entity is called Jiva. Sometimes the Supreme Person of Godhead is also known as Shiva, the all-auspicious. So the difference between Shiva and Jiva is that the all-auspicious Person of Godhead is never affected by the material dualities, whereas the minute portions of the Supreme Person of Godhead are prone to be affected by the dualities of material nature. The supersoul within the body of a particular living entity, although a plenary portion of the Lord, is worshipable by the individual living entity. Great sages have therefore concluded that the process of meditation is designed so that the individual living entity may concentrate his attention on the lotus feet of the super soul form, Vishnu. Hare Krishna. Okay, anyone can continue. Ribo.
Hare Krishna, everyone. This is the real form of the sadhana. The living entities cannot be liberated from the material enlightenment by his own effort. He must therefore take to the devotional service of the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord or the Super Soul within himself. Sri Radha Swami, the great commuter of Sri Bhagavatam, has composed a nice verse in this regard. The purport of which is as follows, my Lord. My dear Lord, I am extremely your part and parcel, but I have been interrupted by the material potentials, which are also emanation from you. As the causes of all causes, you have entered my body as a super soul and have pre-created to the enjoy the supreme blissful life of the knowledge along with you. Therefore, my dear Lord, please order me to render your loving service so that I can bring again be brought to my original position of the transcendental place. Great personalities understand that a living entity entitled engageable in this material world cannot become freed by his own effects. Within this from paid and devotional such great personalities engage themselves in the regarding transcendental loving service to the Lord. This is the verdict of the personal Vedas. The personal Vedas continued. Dear Lord, it is very difficult to achieve perfect knowledge of the absolute truth. Your Lordship is so kind to fallen souls that you have appeared in the different areas, areas and execute different activities. Your appears even as a historical personality of this material world, and your pastimes are very nicely described in the Vedic literatures. Such pastimes are all. Such pastimes are Such pastimes are very nicely described. Such pastimes are attracted as portion of the transcendental bliss. People in the general have an material inclination to read the narration in which ordinary jivas are glorified. But when they are become attractive by the Vedas itself, when they denote your eternal pastimes, they actually dip into the ocean of transcendental bliss. As a fictional man feels refreshed by the dipping into the reserve of water, so that the conscious soul is very much infatuated with the material activities, becomes refused and forced all the pleasures of the material activities simply by dipping into the transcendental oceans of your passion, and eventually emerges in the ocean of the transcendental bliss. The most intelligent devotees, therefore, to the ocean, do not take any meaning of the self, expect devotional services and constantly engage in the nine different process of the devotional life. especially hearing and chanting. When the hearing and chanting about special transcendental pastimes, your devotees do not even care for the transcendental bliss. These are from the revelation of form, merging into the extension of the Supreme. Such devotees are not interested even is called liberation. And Christianly, they have no interest in the material activities for the elevation to the heavenly planets for a sense graduation. Pure devotion seek only the association of Paramanas or the great liberated devotees, so that they can continuously hear and chant your glories. For this purpose, the pure continually hear and chant you. Devotees are prepared to sacrifice all comforts of life, even giving up the material comforts of the family life and so-called society, friends, and love. Those who have tasted the narrator of devotion by realizing the transcendental vibration of chanting your glories, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, do not care for the other physical bliss or material comforts, which appears to the pure devotion to the less important than the straw in the street. The people verified continued. Personal verified continued. Dear Lord, when a person is able to purify his mind, senses, and intelligence by engaging himself in a devotional service in full Krishna conscious, his mind becomes his friend. Otherwise, his mind is always his enemy. Even the mind is engaged in the devotional service of Lord, it becomes immediate friend of the living entities because the mind can think of a supreme Lord always. Your Lord is external dear to the living entities. So when the mind is engaged in thought of you, one immediately feels the great satisfaction for which he has been, which he has, which he has been having his life after. When one mind is thus fixed on the lotus feet of Supreme Personalities of Godhead, one does not do any kind of interfere, worship, or inferior process of self-realization by abstracting to worship a demigod or taking any process of the attempting a worship or self-realization, and the living entity becomes a victim of this birth of cycle and death. And no one can estimate how much the living entity becomes endangered by entertaining the abnormal pieces of life such as cats and dogs. Sri Narottama Das Thakur has said the person who does not take to the devotional service of the Lord but attracted to the process of philosophical supplation and prudent activities drink the poison results of the such actions. Such people are forced to take birth in the different spices of the life and forced to adopt obnoxious practices like meat eating and the intoxication, material purpose, generally worship and transcendence of material body and forgot the welfare of the supreme soul within the body. Some take shelter of the materialistic scientist to improve bodily comforts and take some shelter to worship of demigods in order to promote the heavenly planets. Their goal in life is to make the material body comfortable while forgetting the interest of while forgetting the interest of spirit soul. Such people are described in the Vedic literature as a suicidal because attachments for the material body and its comfort forces the living entity to wander throughout the process of the birth and the death cycle perpetually and suffer the material project as a matter of the course. The human form of the life is chance for the one to understand his position and the most intelligent person to take the devotional services, just to engage his mind, senses, and body in the services of Lord without deviation. The personal Vedas continued. Dear Lord, there are many majestic yogis who are very learned and deliberated in achieving the highest fiction of the life. They engage themselves in the yogic process of the controlling the life air within the body, concentrating the mind upon the form of Vishnu and controlling the senses of very regardly. They practice the yoga system but is not even laborious and regulation. They achieve the same destination as the person who has inequally towards you. In other words, the both yogas and great, whilst philosophical spectators ultimate attend the impersonal Brahmana's impression, which is also automatically attended by the demons who are regular enemies of lords. Demons like Kamsa, Shishupala, Tantavakras also attend the Brahma invocation because they constantly meditate upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Humans such as gopis were attached to Krishna and uh, captivated by his beauty. Their mental concentration on Krishna was promoted by their lust. They wanted they wanted to embrace it by the arms of Krishna, which resembles the beauty around shape of the snake similarly. There are Vedic hymns, and we also simply concentrate our mind on the lotus feet of your Lordship. Humans like gopis concentrate upon the dedicated by the lust, which we upon concentrate Lord lotus feet, your lotus feet to go back to the home, back to the garden. Your enemies also concentrate upon you thinking how to kill you. And yogas undertake the great presences and just to attend your impersonal influences. All these different persons were concentrating their minds in the different ways, achieve spiritual perfection according to their different perspectives because you are equal to the all your devotees. Sri Swami has compared to composed a nice version in this regard. My dear Lord, to engage always in the thinking of your lotus feet is very difficult. It is possible by the great devotees who have already achieved love for you and was engaged in the transcendental love service. My dear Lord, I wish that my mind always be engaged somehow or other on your lotus feet at least for some time. For the attention of the spiritual perfection by the difference, spirituality is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says He grants the perfection the devotee desires in the proportion to the devotee surrender upon Him. The impersonalities, yogas, and enemies of the Lord enter into the Lord's transcendental, but the personalities who are following in the footsteps of inhabitations of Vrindavan or strictly following the path of devotional service are elevated to the personal abode of the Krishna Gokul Vrindavan or the Vaikuntha planets. Both the impersonalities and the personalities enter into the spiritual realm or the spiritual sky, but the impersonalities are given their space in the impersonal Brahmana influences, whereas the personalities has given to the position of the Vaikuntha planet or the Vrindavan planet, according to their desires to serve the Lord in the different ways. The personalized Vedas stated that person who are born after the creation of this material world cannot be understand the existence of the supreme personality of God by manipulating their material knowledge. Just as a person born in a particular family cannot understand the position or his great grandfather who lived before the earth of the recent generation. We are unable to understand supreme personality of the Godhead Narayana or Krishna who exists externally in the spiritual world. In 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly said that Supreme Person who's lived externally in the spiritual kingdom of God, Sad, Sanatana Dharma, can be approached only by the devotional service. As for the material creation, Brahma is the first created person. Before Brahma, there was no living creature. Within this material world, it was void and dark until the Brahma was born on the lotus field, tortured from the abdomen of Grubba Dasak Vishnu. Grubba Vishnu is an expansion of Karnadakshi Vishnu. Karnadakshi Vishnu is the expansion of Sanakrana. Sanakrana is the expansion of Balarama. Balarama is immediate expansion of Lord Krishna after the creation of Brahma. The two kinds of demigods were two types of demigods were born. Demigod is like four brothers Shankar, Sananda, Sanata Kumara, who are representatives of the realization of the world, and demigods like Mercy, sorry, Mikri and their who are meant by the enjoying this material world for those who kinds of demigod were generally manifested all other living entities, including the human beings. Thus, any living creature within this material world, including Brahma, all the demigods and all the Rakshasas are to be considered modern. This means that they are all recently born. Therefore, just as a person recently born in the family cannot understand the situation of the distant forefather, so anyone within the material world cannot understand the position of the Supreme Lord in the Supreme world, this spiritual world, because the material world has only recently been created. Although they have a long duration of existence, all the manifestations of the material world, namely the time element, the living entities, the Vedas, and the other gross substitute elements, all other are created at the same point. Anything manufactured within. Hare Krishna, everyone. Thank you. Now anyone can continue.
Hello. Hare Krishna.
Am I audible?
Yes, Prabhu.
Uh, I will continue.
Yes,
Therefore, by the process of self-realization or God-realization, reflective activities, philosophical speculation, or mystic yoga, can actually approach the supreme source of everything. When the creation is completely terminated, when there is no existence of Vedas, no existence of material time, no existence of the gross and subtle material elements, and when all the living entities are in the non-manifested state, resting within Narayana, then all these manufactured processes become null. Sorry, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna. Am I audible, Prabhuji?
Hare Krishna. Yes, Prabhu.
Sorry, Prabhuji.
No problem. Haribol.
Mm. Then all these manufactured processes become null and void and cannot act. Devotional service, however, is eternal, is eternally going on in the eternal spiritual world. Therefore, the only factual process of self-realization or God-realization is devotional service. And if one takes to this process, he takes to the real process of God-realization. Srila Sridhar Swami has therefore composed a verse in this regard, which conveys the idea that the supreme source of everything, the supreme personality of Godhead, is so great and unlimited that it is not possible for the living entity to understand. It's not possible for Sorry, Prabhuji. Here, my internet is not very fast, Prabhu.
Yes, Prabhu. No problem.
Everyone should therefore pray to the Lord to be engaged in his devotional service eternally, so that by the grace of the Lord one can understand the supreme source of creation. The supreme source of creation, the supreme Lord, reveals himself only to the devotees. The fourth chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says to Arjuna, "My dear Arjuna, because you are my devotee and because you are my intimate friend, I shall therefore reveal to you the process of understanding me." In other words, the supreme source of creation, the supreme personality of Godhead, cannot be understood by our own endeavor. We have to please Him with devotional service, and then will scroll, He will reveal Himself to us. Then we can understand Him to some extent. There are different there are different kinds of philosophers who have tried to understand the supreme source by their mental speculation. There are generally six kinds of mental speculators, and they are called Sad Darshana. All these philosophers and impersonalists are known as Mayavadis. Every one of them has tried to establish his own opinion, although they all have later compromised and stated that all opinions lead to the same goal, and that every opinion is therefore valid according to the prayers of the personified Vedas. However, none of them are valid because of the process of knowledge is created within the temporary material world. They have all missed the real point, the supreme personality of Godhead or the absolute truth. One can understand only by devotional service. One class of philosophers, known as Mimamsakas, represented by sages such as Jaimini, have concluded that everyone should be engaged in pious. Scroll in should be engaged in peer activities or prescribed duties, and that such activities will lead one to the highest perfection. But this is contradicted in the ninth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna says that by pious activities one may be elevated to the heavenly planets, but as soon as one's accumulation of pious activities is used up, one has to leave the enjoyment of the higher standard of material prosperity in the heavenly planets and immediately come down again to these lower planets where the duration of life is very short and where the standard of material happiness is of a lower grade. The exact word used in the Gita are Kshine Punya Martyalokam Vishanti. Therefore, the conclusion of the Mimamsaka philosophers Therefore, therefore, the conclusion of the Mimamsaka philosophers that past activities will lead to one to the absolute is not valid, although a pure devotee is by nature pure. Therefore, although a pure devotee is by nature inclined to pious activities, no one can attain the favor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by pious activities alone. Pious activities may purify one of the contamination caused by ignorance and passion, but this is automatically attained by a devotee who is constantly engaged in hearing the transcendental message of Godhead in the form of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, or similar scriptures. From the Bhagavad Gita, we can understand that even a person who is not up to the standard of pious activities but who is absolutely engaged in devotional service with love and faith is guided from within by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord Himself as Paramatma, the spiritual master sitting within one's heart, gives the devotee exact direction by which he can gradually go back to Godhead. The conclusion of the Mimamsaka philosophers is not actually the truth, which can lead one to the real understanding. Similarly, there are Sankhya philosophers, metaphysicians, or material scientists who study this cosmic manifestation by their invented scientific method and who do not recognize the supreme authority of God as the creator of the cosmic manifestation. Rather, they wrongly conclude that the reaction of material elements is the original cause of creation. The Bhagavad Gita, however, does not accept this theory. It is clearly said therein that behind the cosmic activities is the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This fact is corroborated by the Vedic injunction, Asadva idam agra asit, which means that the origin of creation existed before the cosmic manifestation. Therefore, the material elements cannot be cause of material creation, although the material elements are accepted as material causes. The ultimate cause is the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. The Bhagavad Gita says, therefore, that material nature works under the direction of Krishna. The conclusion of the atheistic Sankhya philosophy is that because the effects of the material worlds are temporary or illusionary, the cause is therefore also illusionary. The Sankhya philosophers are in favor of voidism, but the actual fact is that the original cause is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and this cosmic manifestation is the temporary manifestation of its material energy. When this temporary manifestation is annihilated, its cause, the eternal existence of the spiritual world, when this temporary manifestation is annihilated, its cause, the eternal existence of the spiritual world, continues as it is, and therefore the spiritual world is called Sanatana Dharma, the eternal abode. The conclusion of the Sankhya philosopher is therefore not valid. Then there are philosophers headed by Gautama and Kanada. They have very minutely studied the cause and effect of the material elements and have ultimately come to the conclusion that atomic combination is the original cause of creation. Present material scientists also follow in the footsteps of Gautama and Kanada, who propounded this theory of Paramanuvada. This theory, however, cannot be supported because the original cause of everything is not in atoms. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam as well as in the Vedas, wherein it is also stated, Eko Narayana Asit. Only Narayana existed before the creation. The Srimad Bhagavatam and Vedanta Sutra also say that the original cause is sentient and both indirectly and directly cognizant of everything within this creation. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Aham Sarvasya Prabhavaha, I am the original cause of all, everything. And and Mattah Sarvam Pravartate, from me everything comes into existence. Therefore, atoms may form the basic combinations of material existence, but these atoms are generated from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, the philosophy of Gautama and Kanada cannot be supported. Similarly, impersonalists headed by Ashtavakra and later on by Shankaracharya accept the impersonal Brahman effulgence as the cause of everything. According to their theory, the material manifestation is temporary and unreal, whereas the impersonal Brahman effulgence is reality. But this theory cannot be supported either because the Lord Himself says in the Bhagavad Gita that this Brahman effulgence is resting on His personality. It is also confirmed in the Brahma Samhita that the Brahman effulgence is the personal bodily rays of Krishna. As such, impersonal Brahman cannot be cause of the cosmic manifestation. The original cause is all perfect sentient personality of Godhead, Govinda. Most dangerous theory of the impersonation is that when God comes as an incarnation, he accepts a material body created by the three modes of material nature. He accepts a material body created by the three modes of material nature. This Mayavadi theory has been condemned by the Lord Chaitanya as most offensive. He has said that anyone who accepts the transcendental body of the personality of God has to be made of his material nature commits the greatest offense at the lotus feet of Vishnu. Similarly, the Bhagavad Gita also states that only the fools and rascals deride the personality of Godhead when he descends in a human form. Lord Krishna, Lord Rama, and Lord Chaitanya actually move within human society as human beings. The personified Vedas condemn the impersonal conception as a gross misrepresentation. The Brahma Samhita, the body of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is described as Ananda Chinmaya Rasa. The Supreme Personality of Godhead possesses a spiritual body, not a material body. He can enjoy anything to any part of his body, and therefore he is omnipotent. The limbs of a material body can perform only a particular function, just as hands can hold, but they cannot see or hear. But the body of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is made of Ananda Chinmaya Rasa or Satchidananda Vigraha. He can enjoy anything and do everything with any of his limbs. Acceptance of the spiritual body of the Lord as material is dictated by the tendency to make the spirit supreme personality of Godhead equal to the conditioned soul. The conditioned soul has a material body. Therefore, if God also has a material body, then the impersonalistic theory that the supreme personality of Godhead and the living entities are one and the same can be very easily propagandized. Actually, when the Supreme Personality of Godhead comes, he exhibits different pastimes, and yet there is no difference between the childish body when he is lying on the lap of his mother Yashoda and his so-called grown-up body fighting with the demons. In the childhood body also he fought with demons such as Pudana, Trinavarta, Agasura, etc. His strength equal to the to that which he fought in his youth against demons like Dantravakta, Sisupala, and others. In a material life, as soon as a conditioned soul changes his body, forgets everything of his past body. But from the Bhagavad Gita, we can understand that Krishna, because he has a Satchidananda body, did not forget instructing the sun god about the Bhagavad Gita millions of years ago. The Lord is therefore known as Purushottama because he is transcendental to both material and spiritual existence. That that he is the cause of all causes means that he is the cause of spiritual world and of the material world as well. The supreme personality of Godhead is omnipotent and omniscient. Therefore, because a material body can be neither omnipotent nor omniscient, the Lord's body surely is not material. The Mayavadi theory that the personality of Godhead comes within the material world with a material body cannot be supported by any means can be concluded that all the theories of material philosophers are generated from temporary illusionary existence, like the conclusions in a dream. Such conclusions certainly cannot lead us to the absolute truth. The absolute truth can only be realized through devotional service. As the Lord says in the Bhagavad Gita, Bhaktyamam abhijanati. Only by devotional service one can understand me. Srila Sridhar Swami has composed a nice verse in this regard, which states, My dear Lord, let others be engaged in false argument and dry speculation, theorizing upon these great philosophical theses. Let them loiter in the darkness of ignorance and illusion, falsely enjoying as if very learned scholars, although they are without knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As far as I am concerned, I wish to be liberated simply by chanting the holy names of all beautiful Supreme Personality of Godhead, Madhava, Vamana, Trinayana, Sankarshana, Sripati, and Govinda. Simply by chanting his transcendental names, let me become free from the contamination of this material existence. In this way, the personified Vedas said, My dear Lord, when a living entity by your grace only comes to the right conclusion about your exalted transcendental position, at that time he no longer bothers with the different theories manufactured by the mental speculators or so-called philosophers. This is a reference to the to the speculative theories of Gautama, Kannada, Patanjali, and Kapila, Nirvise, Niriswara. There are actually two Kapilas. One Kapila, the son of Kardama Muni, is the incarnation of the god. incarnation of God, and the other is the atheist of the modern age. The atheistic Kapila is often misrepresented as to be the supreme personality of Godhead who appeared as the son of Kardama Muni during the time of Swayambhu Manu. Lord Kapila, the incarnation of Godhead, appeared long ago. The modern age is the age of Vaivasvata Manu, whereas he appeared during the time of Swayambhuva Manu. According to the Mayavadi philosophy, this manifested world or the material world is mithya or maya, false. Their preaching principle is Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya. According to them, only the Brahman effulgence is true and the cosmic manifestation is illusionary or false. But according to the Vaishnava philosophy, this cosmic manifestation is caused by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that he enters within this material world by one of his plenary portions, and thus the creation takes place. From the Vedas also we can understand that this asat or temporary cosmic manifestation is also an emanation from the supreme sat or fact. From the Vedanta Sutra also it is understood that everything has emanated from the supreme Brahman. As such, the Vaishnavas do not take this cosmic manifestation to be false. The Vaishnava philosophers sees everything in this material world in relationship with the supreme Lord. This conception of the material world is very nicely explained by Srila Rupa Goswami, who said that enunciation of this material world as illusionary or false without knowledge that the material world is also manifestation of the Lord is of no practical use. The Vaishnavas, however, are free from attachment to this worldly world because generally the material world is accepted as an object of sense gratification. The Vaishnavas are not in favor of sense gratification, therefore, they are not attached to the material activities. The Vaishnava accepts this material world according to the regulative principles of the Vedic injunctions. Since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is cause of everything, the Vaishnava sees everything in relationship with Krishna. Even in this material world, by such advanced knowledge, everything becomes spiritualized. In other words, everything in this material world is already spiritual, but due to the lack of our knowledge, we see things as material. The personified Vedas presented the example that those who are seeking after gold do not reject gold earrings, gold bangles, or anything else made of gold simply because they are shaped differently from the original gold. All the living entities are part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and they are qualitatively one. Qualitatively one, but they are now differently shaped in a 8.4 million species of life, just like many different ornaments which have been manufactured from the same source of gold. As one who is interested in gold accepts all the differently shaped gold ornaments, so a Vaishnava, knowing well that all living entities are of the same quality as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, accepts all living entities are eternal servants of God. As a Vaishnava, then one has ample opportunity to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead simply by reclaiming this condition, mislead living entities, training them in Krishna consciousness, and leading them back home, back to Godhead. The fact is that the minds of the living entities are now agitated by the three material qualities, and the living entities are therefore transmigrating as if in dreams from one body to another. Their consciousness is changed into Krishna consciousness. However, they immediately fix Krishna within their hearts, and thus their path for liberation becomes clear. In all the Vedas, the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entities are stated to be of the same quality, Chaitanya or spiritual. This is also confirmed in the Padma Purana, wherein it is stated that there are two kinds of spiritual entities. One is called Jiva, and the other is called the Supreme Lord. Beginning from Lord Brahma down to the ant, all living entities are jivas, whereas the Lord is the supreme four-handed Vishnu or Janardana. The word Atma can be applied only to the supreme personality of Godhead because the living entities are his part and partial. Sometimes the word Atma is applied to them also. The living entities are therefore called Jivatma, and the supreme Lord is called Paramatma. Both the Paramatma and the Jivatma are within the material world, and therefore this material has a purpose other than the sense gratification. The conception of a life of sense gratification is illusionary, but the conception of service by the Jivatma to the Paramatma, even in this material world, is not at all illusionary. The Krishna conscious person is fully aware of this fact, and thus he does not take care. take this material world to be false, but acts in the reality of transcendental service. The devotee therefore sees everything in this material world as the opportunity to serve the Lord. He does not reject anything as material, but devotes everything in the service of the Lord. Thus, a devotee is always in transcendental position, and everything that he uses becomes spiritually purified by being used in the service of the Lord. Sridhar Swami has composed a nice verse in this regard. I worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is always manifested as reality, even within this material world, which is considered by some to be false. The conception of the falsity of this material world is due to lack of knowledge, but a person advanced in Krishna consciousness sees that sees the supreme personality of Godhead in everything. This is actually realization of Vedic aphorism. Sarvam kalu idam Brahma, everything is Brahman. The person for Vedas continued. Dear Lord, lest intelligent men take to other ways of self-realization, but actually there is no chance to become purified from material contamination or to stop the repeated cycle of birth and death, unless one is a thoroughly pure devotee. Our dear Lord, everything is resting on your different potencies and therefore is supported by you. As is stated in the Vedas, Eko Bahunam Yo Vidadati Kaman. Therefore, your Lordship is the supporter and maintainer of all living entities, demigods, human beings, and animals. Everyone is supported by you, and you are also situated in everyone's heart. In other words, you are the root of all. You are the root of whole creation. Therefore, those who are engaged in your devotional service without deviation always worship you. Such devotees actually pour water on the root of the universal tree. By devotional service, therefore, one satisfies not only the personality of Godhead, but also all others, because everyone is maintained and supported by him. Because he understands the all-pervasive future of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, a devotee, a devotee is the most practical philanthropist and altruist. Uh, altruist. Such pure devotees, thoroughly engaged in Krishna consciousness, very easily overcome the cycle of birth and death, and they as much as jump over the hand of death. Guruji, can I continue or some devotee continues from this?
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu. Anyone can continue also. Hare Krishna, Hare Prabhu, and Yaku Prabhu, please accept my humble obeisance. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. You can also continue.
A devotee is never afraid of death or of changing his body. His consciousness is transformed into Krishna consciousness. And even if he does not go back to Godhead, even if he transmigrates to another material body, he has nothing to fear. A vivid example is Bharata Maharaja. Although in his next life he became a deer, in the life after that he became completely free from all material contamination and was elevated to the kingdom of God. The Bhagavad Gita affirms, therefore, that a devotee is never vanquished. A devotee's path to the spiritual kingdom, back home, back to Godhead, is guaranteed. Even though a devotee sleeps in one birth, the continuation of his Krishna consciousness elevates him further and further until he goes back to Godhead. Not only does a pure devotee purify his own personal existence, but whoever becomes his disciple also ultimately becomes purified and able to enter the kingdom of God without difficulty. Not only can a pure devotee easily surpass death, but by his grace his followers also can do so without difficulty. The power of devotional service is so great that a pure devotee can electrify another person by his transcendental instruction on crossing over the ocean of nescience. The instructions of a pure devotee to his disciple are also very simple. No one feels any difficulty in following in the footsteps of a pure devotee. Anyone who follows in disciplic succession from recognized devotees of the Lord, such as Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva, the Kumaras, Manu, Kapila, King Prahlada, King Janaka, Shukadeva Goswami, Yamaraja, etc., very easily finds the door of liberation open. On the other hand, those who are not devotees but are engaged in uncertain processes of self-realization, such as jnana, yoga, and karma, are understood to be still contaminated. Such contaminated persons, although apparently advanced in self-realization, cannot even liberate themselves, not to speak of others who follow them. Such non-devotees are compared to chained animals, for they are not able to go beyond the jurisdiction of the formalities of a certain type of faith. In the Bhagavad Gita, they are condemned as Vedavada. They cannot understand that the Vedas deal with activities of the material modes of nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. Lord Krishna advised Arjuna that one has to go beyond the jurisdiction of the duties prescribed in the Vedas and take to Krishna consciousness, devotional service. It is said in the Bhagavad Gita, Nistraigunyo Pavarjuna. My dear Arjuna, just try to become transcendental to the Vedic rituals. This transcendental position beyond the Vedic ritualistic performances is devotional service. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord clearly says that persons who are engaged in his devotional service without adulteration are situated in Brahman. Actual Brahman realization means Krishna consciousness and engagement in devotional service. The devotees are therefore real brahmacharis because their activities are always in Krishna consciousness, devotional service. The Krishna consciousness movement is therefore a supreme call to all kinds of religionists, asking them with great authority to join this movement by which one can learn how to love God and thus surpass all formulas and formalities of scriptural injunction. A person who cannot overcome the jurisdiction of stereotyped religious principles is compared to an animal chained up by his master. The purpose of all religion is to understand God and develop one's dormant love of Godhead. If one simply sticks to the religious formulas and formalities and does not become elevated to the position of love of God, he is considered to be a chained animal. In other words, if one is not in Krishna consciousness, he is not eligible for liberation from the contamination of material existence. Srila Sridhara Swami has composed a nice verse which says, "Let others engage in severe austerities, let others fall to the land from the tops of hills and give up their lives, let others travel to many holy places of pilgrimage for salvation, or let them be engaged in deep study of philosophy and Vedic literature." Yes, I hate that word. Let the mystic yogis engage in their meditational service, and let the different sects engage in unnecessary arguing as to which is the best. But it is a fact that unless one is Krishna conscious, unless one is engaged in devotional service, and unless one has the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he cannot cross over this material ocean. An intelligent person, therefore, gives up all stereotyped ideas and joins the Krishna consciousness movement for factual liberation. The personified Vedas continued their prayers. Our dear Lord, your impersonal feature is explained in the Vedas. You have no hands, but you can accept all sacrifices which are offered to you. You have no legs, but you can walk more swiftly than anyone. Although you have no eyes, you can see whatever happens in the past, present, and future. Although you have no ears, you can hear everything that is said. Although you have no mind, you know everyone and everyone's activities, past, present, and future. And yet no one knows who you are. You know everyone, but no one knows you. Therefore, you are the oldest and supreme personality. Similarly, in another part of the Vedas, it is said, you have nothing to do. You are so perfect in your knowledge and potency that everything becomes manifest simply by your will. There is no one equal to or greater than you, and everyone is acting as your eternal servant. Thus, the Vedic statements describe that the Absolute has no legs, no hands, no eyes, no ears, and no mind, and yet he can act through his potencies and fulfill the needs of all living entities. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, his hands and legs are everywhere. He is all pervasive. The hands, legs, ears, and eyes of all living entities are acting and moving by the direction of the Supersoul sitting within the living entity's heart. Unless the Supersoul is present, it is not possible for the hands and legs to be active. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is so great, independent, and perfect, however, that even without having any eyes, legs, and ears, he is not dependent on others for his activities. On the contrary, others are dependent on him for the activities of their different sense organs. Unless the living entity is inspired and directed by the Supersoul, he cannot act. The fact is that ultimately the absolute truth is the supreme person, but because he's acting through his different potencies which are impossible for the gross materialists to see, the materialists accept him as impersonal. For example, one can observe the personal artistic work in a painting of a flower, and one can understand that the color adjustment, the shape, etc., have demanded the minute attention of the artist. The artist's work is clearly exhibited in a painting of different blooming flowers, but the gross materialists, without seeing the hand of God in such artistic manifestations as the actual flowers blooming in nature, concludes that the absolute truth is impersonal. Actually, the absolute is personal, but he is independent. He does not require to personally take a brush and colors to paint the flowers, but his potencies are acting so wonderfully that it appears as if flowers have come into being without the aid of an artist. The impersonal view of the absolute truth is accepted by less intelligent men, because unless one is engaged in the service of the Lord, he cannot understand how the Supreme is acting. He cannot even know his name. Everything about his activities and personal features is revealed to the devotee only through his loving service attitude. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly said, Bhoktaram Yakya Tapasam. The Lord is the enjoyer of all kinds of sacrifices and of the results of all austerities. Then again, the Lord says, Sarva Loka Maheshwaram. I am the proprietor of all planets. So that is the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although he is present in Vrindavana and enjoys transcendental pleasure in the company of his eternal associates, the gopis and the cowherd boys, his potencies are acting under his direction all over the creation. They do not disturb his eternal pastimes. Through devotional service, only can one understand how the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by his inconceivable potencies, simultaneously acts impersonally and as a person. He's acting just like the Supreme Emperor, and many thousands of kings and chiefs are working under him. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the supreme, independent, controlling person, and all the demigods, including Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva, Indra, the King of Heaven, the King of the Moon Planet, and the King of the Sun Planet, are working under his direction. It is confirmed in the Vedas that the sun is shining, the air is blowing, and fire is distributing heat out of fear of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The material nature is producing all kinds of movable and immovable objects within the material world, but none of them can independently act or create without the direction of the Supreme Lord. All of them are acting as tributaries, okay, I don't know, just like subordinate kings who offer their annual taxes to the emperor. The Vedic injunction states that every living entity lives by eating the remnants of foodstuffs offered to the personality of Godhead. In great sacrifices, the injunction is that Narayana should be present as the supreme predominating deity of the sacrifice, and after the sacrifice is performed, the remnants of foodstuffs are distributed amongst the demigods. This is called Yagyabhaga. Every demigod has an allotment of Yagyabhaga, which he accepts as prasadam. The conclusion is that the demigods are not independently powerful. They are posted as different executives under the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they are eating prasadam, or the remnants of sacrifices. They are executing the order of the Supreme Lord exactly according to his plan. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is in the background, and his orders are carried out by others. It only appears that he is impersonal. In our grossly materialistic way, we cannot conceive how the Supreme Person is above the impersonal activities of material nature. Therefore, the Lord explains in the Bhagavad Gita that there is nothing superior to himself, and the impersonal Brahman is subordinately situated as a manifestation of his personal race. Shripada Srila Sridhara Swami has therefore composed a nice verse in this regard. Let me offer my respectful obeisances unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who has no material senses, but through whose direction and will all the material senses are working. He is the supreme potency of all material senses or sense organs. He is omnipotent and he is the supreme performer of everything. Therefore, he is worshipable by everyone. Unto that supreme person do I offer my respectful obeisances. Krishna himself declares in the Bhagavad Gita that he is Purushottama, which means the supreme personality. Purusha means person and Uttama means supreme or transcendental. Also in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord declares that because he is transcendental to all sentient and insentient beings, he is therefore known as the Purushottama. In another place, the Lord says that as the air is situated in the all-pervading sky, so everyone is situated in him and everyone is acting under his direction. The Vedas personified continued. Our dear Lord, they prayed, you are equal to all with no partiality toward a particular type of living entity. As your parts and parcels, all living entities enjoy or suffer in different conditions of life. They are just like the sparks of a fire. Just as sparks dance on a blazing fire, so all living entities are dancing on your support. You are providing them with everything they desire, and yet you are not responsible for their position of enjoyment or suffering. There are different types of living entities: demigods, human beings, animals, trees, birds, beasts, germs, worms, insects, and aquatics, and all are enjoying or suffering in life by resting on you. The living entities are of two kinds. One class is called ever liberated, Nitya Mukta, and the other class is called Nitya Pada. The Nitya Mukta living entities are in the spiritual kingdom, and the Nitya Pada are in the material world. In the spiritual world, both the Lord and the living entities are manifest in their original status, like live sparks in a blazing fire. But in the material world, although the Lord is all-pervasive in his impersonal feature, the living entities have forgotten their Krishna consciousness, just as sparks sometimes fall from a blazing fire and lose their original brilliant condition. Some sparks fall on the dry grass and thus ignite another big fire. This is a reference to the pure devotees who take compassion on the poor and innocent living entities. The pure devotee enlightens Krishna consciousness in the hearts of the conditioned souls, and thus the blazing fire of the spiritual world becomes manifest even within this material world. Some sparks fall on the water, and they immediately lose their original brilliance and become almost extinct. This is comparable to the living entities who take their birth in the midst of gross materialists, in which case their original Krishna consciousness becomes almost extinct. Some sparks fall to the ground and remain midway between the blazing and extinct conditions. Thus, some living entities are without Krishna consciousness, some are between having and not having Krishna consciousness, and some are actually situated in Krishna consciousness. The demigods in the higher planets, beginning from Lord Brahma, Indra, Chandra, the sun god, the moon god, and various other demigods, are all Krishna conscious. Human society is between the demigods and the animals, and thus some are more or less Krishna conscious, and some are completely forgetful of Krishna consciousness. The third grade living entities, namely the animals, beasts, plants, trees, and aquatics, have completely forgotten Krishna consciousness. This example stated in the Vedas of the sparks of a blazing fire is very appropriate for understanding the condition of different types of living entities. But above all other living entities is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, or Purushottama, who is always liberated from all material conditions. The question may be raised as to why the living entities have fallen by chance into different conditions of life. To answer this question, we first have to understand that there cannot be any influence of chance for the living entities. Chance is for non-living entities. According to the Vedic literature, living entities have knowledge, and thus they are called Chaitanya, okay, which means in knowledge, Chaitanya. Their situation in different conditions of life, therefore, is not accidental. It is by their choice because they have knowledge. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says, "Give up everything and just surrender unto me." This process of realizing the Supreme Personality of Godhead is open for everyone, but still it is the choice of the particular living entity whether to accept or reject this proposal. In the last portion of the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna very plainly said to Arjuna, "My dear Arjuna, now I have spoken everything to you. Everything now depends on whether you choose to accept it." Similarly, the living entities who have come down to this material world have made their own choice to enjoy this material world. It is not that Krishna sent them into this material world. The material world is created for the enjoyment of living entities who wanted to give up the eternal service of the Lord to become the supreme enjoyer themselves. According to Vaishnava philosophy, when a living entity desires to gratify his senses and forgets the service of the Lord, he is given a place in the material world to act freely according to his desire, and therefore he creates a condition of life in which he either enjoys or suffers. We should know definitely that both the Lord and the living entities are eternally cognizant. There is no birth and death for either the Lord or the living entities. When creation takes place, it does not mean that the living entities are created. The Lord creates this material world to give the conditioned souls a chance to elevate themselves to the higher platform of Krishna consciousness. If the conditioned soul does not take advantage of this opportunity, then after dissolution of this material world, he enters in the body of Narayana and remains there in deep sleep until the time of another creation. In this connection, the example of the rainy season is very appropriate. Seasonal rainfall may be taken as the agent for creation because after the rainfall, the wet fields are favorable for growing different types of vegetation. Similarly, as soon as there is creation by the Lord's glancing over the material nature, immediately the living entities bring up in their different living conditions, such as different types of vegetation grow after a rainfall. Haripol, someone can continue.
Okay, Prabhu, I can read.
Hare Krishna is Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. The rainfall is one, but the creation of the different vegetables is varied. The rain falls equally on the whole field, but the different vegetables sprout up in different shapes and different forms according to the seeds planted. Similarly, the seeds of our desires are varied. Every living entity has a different type of desire, and that desire is the seed which causes his growth in a certain type of body. This is explained by Rupa Goswami by the word Papa Bija. Papa means sinful. All our material desires are to be taken as Papa Bija, or the seeds of sinful desires. Bhagavad Gita explains that our sinful desire is that we do not surrender unto the Supreme Lord. The Lord therefore says in Bhagavad Gita, I shall give you protection from the resultant actions of sinful desires. These sinful desires are manifested in different types of bodies. Therefore, no one can accuse the Supreme Lord of partiality, and he is giving one type of body to a certain type of living entity and another type of body to another living entity. All the bodies of the 8,400,000 species come according to the mental condition of the individual living entities. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Purushottama, only gives them a chance to act according to their desires. Therefore, the living entities are acting, taking advantage of the facility given by the Lord. At the same time, they are born from the transcendental body of the Lord. This relationship between the Lord and the living entities is explained in the Vedic literatures, wherein it is said that the Supreme Lord maintains all his children, giving them whatever they want. Similarly, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says, I am the seed-giving father of all living entities. It is very simple to understand that the father gives birth to the children, but the children act according to their own desires. Therefore, the father is never responsible for the different futures of his children. Each child can take advantage of the father's property and instruction, but even though the inheritance and instruction may be the same for all the children, out of their different desires, each child creates a different life and thereby suffers and enjoys. Similarly, the Bhagavad Gita's instructions are equal for everyone. Everyone should surrender unto the Supreme Lord, and he will take charge of them and protect them from sinful reactions. The facilities of living in the creation of the Lord are equally offered to all living entities. Whatever there is, either on the land, on water, or in the sky, is equally given to all living entities. Since they are all sons of the Supreme Lord, everyone can enjoy the material facilities given by the Lord, but unfortunate living entities create unfavorable conditions of life by fighting among themselves. The responsibility for this fighting and creating favorable and unfavorable situations of life lies with the living entities, not with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, if the living entities take advantage of the Lord's instructions as given in the Bhagavad Gita, and develop Krishna consciousness, then their lives become sublime, and they can go back to Godhead. One may argue that because this material world is created by the Lord, he is therefore responsible for its condition. Certainly, he is indirectly responsible for the creation and maintenance of this material world, but he is never responsible for the different conditions of the living entities. The Lord's creation of this material world is compared to the cloud's creation of vegetation. The rainy season, the cloud creates different varieties of vegetables. The cloud pours water on the surface of the earth, but it never touches the earth directly. Similarly, the Lord creates this material world simply by dancing over the material energy. This is confirmed in the Vedas. He threw his glance over the material nature, and thus there was creation. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is also confirmed that simply by his transcendental glance over the material nature, he creates different varieties of entities, both movable and immovable, living and dead. Creation of the material world can therefore be taken as one of the pastimes of the Lord. It is called one of the pastimes of the Lord because he creates this material world whenever he desires. This desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also extreme mercy on his part because it gives another chance to the conditioned souls to develop their original consciousness and thus go back to Godhead. Therefore, no one can blame the Supreme Lord for creating this material world. From the subject matter under discussion, we can gain a clear understanding of the difference between the impersonalized and the personalized. The impersonal conception recommends merging in the existence of the Supreme, and the voidist philosophy recommends making all material varieties void. But these philosophies are known as Mayavada. Certainly the cosmic manifestation comes to a close. It becomes void when the living entities merge into the body of Narayana to rest until another creation, as this may be called an impersonal condition, but these conditions are never eternal. The cessation of the variegatedness of the material world and the merging of the living entities into the body of the Supreme are not permanent, because the creation will take place again, and the living entities who merge into the body of the Supreme without having developed their Krishna consciousness will again appear in this material world when there is another creation. Bhagavad Gita confirms the fact that this material world is created and annihilated. This is going on perpetually, and conditioned souls who are without Krishna consciousness come back again and again whenever the material creation is manifest. If such conditioned souls take advantage of this opportunity, develop Krishna consciousness under the direct instructions of the Lord, then they are transferred to a spiritual world and do not have to come back again to the material creation. It is said, therefore, that the voidists and the impersonalists are not very intelligent because they do not take shelter under the lotus feet of the Lord. Because they are less intelligent, these voidists and impersonalists take to different types of austerities, either to attain the stage of nirvana, which means finishing the material conditions of life, or to attain oneness by merging into the body of the Lord. All of them again fall down because they neglect the lotus feet of the Lord. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the author Krsna Das Kaviraja Goswami, after studying all the Vedic literatures and hearing from all authorities, has given his opinion that Krishna is the only supreme master and that all living entities are his eternal servants. His statement is confirmed in the prayers by the personified Vedas. Conclusion is therefore that everyone is under the control of the Supreme Personality, Godhead. Everyone is serving under the supreme direction of the Lord, and everyone is afraid of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is out of fear of him that activities are being rightly executed. Everyone's position is to be subordinate to the Supreme Lord, yet the Lord has no personality in his view of the living entities. He is just like the unlimited sky. As the sparks of a fire dance in the fire, similarly all living entities are like birds flying in the unlimited sky. Some of them are flying very high, some are flying at a lesser altitude, and some are flying at a still lesser altitude. The different birds are flying in different positions according to their respective abilities to fly, but the sky has nothing to do with this ability. The Bhagavad Gita also, the Lord confirms that he awards different positions to different living entities according to their proportionate surrender. This proportionate reward by the personality of Godhead to the living entities is not partiality. Therefore, in spite of the living entities being situated in different positions, in different spheres, in different species of life, all of them are always under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Yet he is never responsible for their different living conditions. It's foolish and artificial, therefore, to think oneself equal to the Supreme Lord. And it is still more foolish to think that one has not seen God. Everyone is seeing God in his different aspects. The only difference is that the theist sees God as the Supreme Personality, the most beloved, Krishna. The atheist sees the absolute truth as ultimate death. The personified Vedas continue to pray. For dear Lord, from all Vedic information it is understood that you are the supreme controller, and all living entities are controlled. Both the Lord and the living entities are called Nitya, eternal, and so are qualitatively one. Yet the singular Nitya, or the Supreme Lord, is the controller, whereas the plural Nityas are controlled. The individual controlled living entity resides within the body. The supreme controlled or super soul is also present there, but the super soul is controlling the individual soul. That is the verdict of the Vedas. If the individual soul were not controlled by the super soul, then how could one explain the Vedic version that the living entity transmigrates from one body to another, enjoying and suffering the effects of his past deeds? Sometimes he is promoted to a higher standard of life, and sometimes he is degraded to a lower standard of life. Thus, the conditioned souls are not only under the control of the Supreme Lord, but they are also conditioned by the control of the material nature. The relationship of the living entities to the Supreme Lord as the controlled and the controller evidently proves that although the super soul is all pervasive, the individuals, living entities are never all pervasive. If the individual souls were all pervasive, there would be no question of their being controlled. The theory that the super soul and the individual soul are equal is therefore a polluted conclusion, and no sensible person accepts it. Rather, one should try to understand the distinction between the supreme eternal and the subordinate eternals. Krishna, does someone else want to continue?
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Prabhu. Okay, now we can go to 6 Astakam prayers because this chapter it's never ending. There is still like 30 pages. So let's continue tomorrow. And this was like the longest prayer I've read now. It just continues. The personified Vedas have so much to say. It's really amazing. And also that I like that cloud analogy that was there, that the cloud is pouring water without touching the ground. So it's not that the cloud is directly growing the vegetables, but still it's the reason for the vegetables to grow. Okay, 6 Astagam pairs. Cheto darpanamarjanam bhavamahadavagnirvapanam shreyah kairava chandrika vitaranam vidyavadu jivanam anandam buddhivardhanam pratipadam purnamritasvadanam sarvatma snapanam param vijayate Sri Krishna Sankirtanam.
Nam namakaripa practice tatrapitanyamita smaranena kala. Tadrisi tava kripa bhagavamamapi turdhamam idrisa mihajanin anuraga.
Trinad api sunichena, tarorapi sahisnuna, amanina manadena, kirtaniya sada hari.
Nadanam najanam nasundarim kavitam va jagadisha kamaye mama janmani janmanishvare bhavatad bhaktirahai dukit vai.
Nainanda tanusha kinkaram patitamam bhishame bhavam burao kripaya tava para pankajasti tadulisa drisam vichintaya.
Nayanam galad ashrutaraya, vadanam katkadarutaya, kira pahagar, vichita vapukada, tavanama grahane pavishyati.
युगायितं निमेषेण चक्षुषा प्रावृष्टायितं शून्यायितं जगत्सर्वं गोविन्दविरहेण मे
Ashlisya va padaratam pinashtumam adarshanan marmahatam karotu va yatha tata va vidatu lampato matprananatas tusaevana praha. Translation. Haribol. Glory to the Sri Krishna Sankirtan, which cleanses the heart of all the dust accumulated for years and extinguishes the fire of conditional life of repeated birth and death. This Sankirtan movement is the prime benediction for humanity at large because it spreads the rays of the benediction moon. It is the life of all transcendental knowledge. It increases the ocean of transcendental bliss and it enables us to fully taste the nectar for which we are always anxious.
O my Lord, your holy name alone can render all benediction to the living being, unless you have hundreds and millions of names like Krishna and Govinda. In these transcendental names, you have invested all your transcendental energies. There are not even hard and fast rules for chanting these names. O my Lord, out of kindness, you enable us to easily approach you by your names. I am so unfortunate that I have no attraction for them.
One should chant the holy name of the Lord in a humble state of mind, thinking oneself lower than the straw in the street. One should be more tolerant than a tree, devoid of all sense of false prestige, and should be ready to offer all respect to others. In such a state of mind, one can chant the holy name of the Lord constantly.
O Almighty Lord, I have no desire to accumulate wealth, nor do I desire beautiful women, nor do I want any number of followers. I only want your causeless devotional service, birth after birth.
O son of Maharaja Nanda, Krishna, I am your eternal servitor, yet somehow or other I have fallen into this ocean of birth and death. Please pick me up from this ocean of death and place me as one of the atoms at your lotus feet.
O my Lord, when will my eyes be decorated with tears of love flowing constantly when I chant your holy name? When will my voice choke up, and when will the hairs of my body stand on end at the recitation of your name?
O Govinda, feeling your separations, I'm considering a moment to be like 12 years or more. Tears are flowing from my eyes like torrents of rain, and I'm feeling all vacant in the world in your absence.
I know no one but the Lord, and he shall remain so even if he handles me roughly by his embrace or makes me broken-hearted by not being present before me. He is completely free to do anything and everything, for he is always my worshipful Lord, unconditionally.
हरि बोल श्री शिक्षाष्टकम की जय, हरिनाम संकीर्तन की जय, पंचतत्व की जय, नित्यानंद प्रभु की जय, श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य महाप्रभु की जय, जगत गुरु शिला भक्ति वेदांत स्वामी शिला प्रभुपाद की जय, निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे, हरि हरि बोल।